Now, Eric, as a professional podcaster, you should be aware that the words I'm speaking right at this moment are called a cold open. It's important that we get the nomenclature right if we want to be taken seriously in this industry, because after all, we are the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Thank you for joining us on the 70th episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name is Eric. I'm here today with my podcast host, Tom. Paperback Warrior began as a blog where Tom and I post daily reviews of the vintage paperbacks we enjoy from the 20th century in the men's adventure, hard-boiled crime, spy, war, and western genres. Here lately, we've even been dabbling in classic horror and science fiction as well. The blog's still going strong at paperbackwarrior.com, and 2 years ago, we expanded our media empire to include this very podcast, with new episodes every Monday, and free archives with hours and hours of vintage paperback discussions. So let me bring on Tom to tell us what we have this week on the show.
Thank you, Eric. Our feature this week is a popular Sword and Planet sexy adventure series called the Richard Blade series, written under the pseudonym of Jeffrey Lord. Meanwhile, I'm going to be reviewing a very earthly standalone novel called One for the Road, written in 1954 by Howard Hunt, under his Robert Dietrich pseudonym. What are you reviewing? I literally do not know.
Today I'm going to be reviewing Phoenix Force Number 1 by a guy named Robert Hoskins.
All right, I like that. Those are pseudonym books, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, cool. Anyway, before we get into the fun, why don't you shout out some of our super fans and sort of explain why we're doing that?
Sure thing. Like I explained in the intro, as Paperback Warrior has a blog where Tom and I review old books daily, as well as producing this weekly podcast. And in this venture, it really costs us money, and neither of us want to sell ads that clog up the show here, nor do we want to put any of our content behind a paywall that prevents you from listening. Instead, the business model we chose mimics that of National Public Radio, or the piano bar at the end of the street. We take tips and donations from our fans to keep us afloat. You can donate to us by going to paperbackwarrior.com, the desktop version, not the mobile, and clicking on the PayPal link at the upper right-hand corner to make a donation. If you can help us out, we'd appreciate it. If you can't, don't sweat it. We're just happy you listen. And every so often, we like to recognize the superfans who donate with a shout-out on the show. So today, we want to recognize the following action figures who keep the lights on around this place. We've got Max Romano, David Kowalski, Michael Galbraith, Oliver Pink, Frank Soka, and Marie Callahan. So superfans, thank you so much. You're appreciated.
All right. But now, before we get into our feature, Eric, you sent me a text message the other night because you were very excited about something you found online involving one of your favorite authors. Why don't you tell the listeners what you discovered?
Well, I really should give credit to Bob Dice, one of our good friends and supporters of the show. He kind of led me down this road. But there's this author I really enjoy named Clark Howard, who wrote a lot of great mystery and adventure novels years ago. He was born in Tennessee in 1916 and was orphaned early in life. He grew up a ward of the state living in foster homes before finally settling into a foster home or orphanage in Chicago. He was a straight-up juvenile delinquent, and he went to reform school and then later joined the Marine Corps at age 17. And as the Marines often do, they straightened this young man out. He fought in the bloody Punch Bowl battle during the Korean War, and after the war he went to journalism school at Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois.
It should be said that I was born in Evanston, Illinois.
Where were you?
It's important that I make every feature about me. So continue.
Yeah, good. I sold a lot of insurance there, actually. As often happens when you try to teach a young man how to write, Clark Howard's professor said that his writing was undisciplined and had no commercial value, so he dropped out of the program.
Oh, man.
Of course, by that point, Clark had already sold 2 stories to magazines, and he probably sold more than his writing teacher at that point. So Clark Howard went on to write more than 16 books and 200 short stories. He was a regular contributor to both Ellery Queen Mystery Magazine and Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. And he also won lots of awards, including the prestigious Edgar Award for Best Short Story. Clark Howard died in 2016, and his work has been largely forgotten, which is a real shame because he's really, really good. I reviewed 2 of his books at paperbackwarrior.com. The first one was called Last Contract from 1973, It was his fifth book, and it was published by Pinnacle. The novel's about a professional assassin named Trevor who kills for a shadowy agency called the System. After 17 years and 27 kills, Trevor wants to retire from the killing game. Unfortunately, there's no retirement plan at this government agency, and the System has other ideas about what happens to their killers when they try to step away from the job. The book was awesome, and I know our listeners will really enjoy it as well. Again, it's called Last Contract by Clark Howard. The other book I reviewed by him was called Siberia 10, and it was also published by Pinnacle in 1973. It's about a fictional U.S. Marine Corps military prison in San Diego, California, housing these wayward soldiers. And the prison is originally run by a brutal warden. And there's this growing black militant group inside, and all sorts of violence and drama among the prison staff and their inmates. Man, I love this book, and we'll probably read it again one day. Again, it's called Siberia 10 by Clark Howard. And over the past few years, I've turned the world upside down trying to get my hands on more and more books by Clark Howard. And they're hard to find, and it's frustrating to me that more people don't know about this guy because, Tom, he's really, really good.
Yeah.
And I know that whenever you find a Clark Howard book during your travels, you've been kind enough to pick them up for me, so my collection is filling in nicely. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because publisher Mysterious Press has made a deal with Clark Howard's estate to reprint his novels as Kindle ebooks. So you don't really need to travel the globe to get your hands on a copy. This is going to save me a lot of legwork, but it's also going to cost me some cash because each of his ebooks is priced at $9.99.
Oh, I hate that. That is way too much for an ebook.
I agree, but at least they're finally available.
I guess, yeah. I remember finding a book, I'm trying to remember the name of it, by him, and giving it to you, and I spent the last 3 years wishing I had read it first.
What book was it?
Okay, as I recall, it was called The Last Great Death Stunt.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, yeah. It was published in 1977, and if I'm remembering rightly, it involves this new law that gets passed outlawing dangerous stunts and stuntmen like Evel Knievel type stuff. But before the law goes into effect, a team of daredevils plans some kind of super dangerous stunt. And I just remember reading the back of the book and thinking that it looked awesome.
It's part of the new batch of books that they're actually re-releasing.
Oh, cool.
So you're in luck.
All right. Now let me check that out. I remember years ago, and you may remember this as well, you and I were on a road trip together buying books down in south of here. We're up in North Florida going a little bit south. And you were going on and on in that trip in the car ride about Clark Howard and how great he was. On that very trip, I bought this huge lot of Alfred Hitchcock mystery magazines from the late 1960s and early 1970s. And remember, as you were driving, I was going through those issues and seeing one story after another that Clark Howard had in them. And I remember segregating those copies for you so you could have those in your collection. I'm surprised that Wildside Press or some of the other reprint houses haven't released a Clark Howard mega pack filled with his short stories, culled from the digest, because they do that with other authors.
Looking through these re-releases, they've got one short story compilation, and it's called Crowded Lives, but I'm not really sure where these stories originally appeared at.
Well, I mean, with over 200 published short stories, there's clearly room for more. So we know a lot of these reprint houses, and they always listen to our show to get ideas on what to reprint. And so if someone wanted to take the time to go through Clark Howard's back library in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine and Ellery Queen, there's got to be just a gold mine of great stories there.
Yeah, I agree. But anyway, the author's name is Clark Howard, and you can check out these reprints from Mysterious Press, which is also known as Open Road Media. But thanks to our good friend Bob Dice for leading us to this information. Tom, why don't you do your feature?
Okay, music please. Our feature today is on the Richard Blade adult fantasy series, written under the house name of Jeffrey Lord. The books were published in the U.S. by Pinnacle between the years 1969 and 1984, and the U.S. paperbacks went for 37 books. I think the first few books in the series were originally published by McFadden, and then Pinnacle ended up reprinting those with more uniform covers and then continued the series thereafter. Now, the series was the brainchild of this guy named Lyle Kenyon Ingle, who owned a company called Book Creations Incorporated, or BCI. It was an interesting business model that Ingle formed because what they did is they produced some of the most iconic series titles in the world of historical fiction and men's adventure fiction. The idea is that Ingle would come up with a concept for a book series and a house name that would pose as the author. So there was uniformity throughout the series, even though he'd hired different authors to write them. So Ingle would hire these authors who would write the books in the series, and he would pay them a flat fee or maybe a percentage, 50% is what I heard, of the royalties. Now, Book Creations Incorporated edits the books and probably designs the cover and does everything ready for it to be printed, and then they sell the book in its entirety to publishers like Pinnacle. The publisher would then pay Ingle for the publication rights and royalties on the sales, and Book Creations would keep that money and then share some with the author because Book Creations was the producer who brought these books to life. Let's see. I was also told by authors, I'm trying to put this delicately, authors who did work with Ingle, that he wasn't always good about sharing money with the royalties.
Really?
Yeah, he and again, I don't want to disparage the guy because these are just rumors, but that he, had contracts with these authors and the royalties would flow into Book Creations, and maybe he wasn't fairly sharing his royalties, let's say.
If you're the author, how do you really know how many books you sold?
You don't. It's why it's so important to do business with honorable publishers. In fact, I know that's why a lot of people, these authors who are still around today, love to do business with Wolfpack Publishing, because that's one publisher who presents everybody with a really clear accounting of the books that are sold and how the royalties work. Beyond that, I think a lot of these guys are just operating on faith. Yeah. I know Manor Books used to rip people off left and right, and Stephen Mertz tells stories about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, I have no knowledge of Book Creations firsthand, so we probably shouldn't even get too deep into disparaging this guy, but he's dead. Ingle was the guy who invented Nick Carter Killmaster and John Eagle Expediter, the Baroness, Stagecoach, and others. So he definitely could produce good series books. Anyway, so let's get into it. So in 1969, Ingle has an idea. What if we take James Bond, or a James Bond-like character, and somehow transport him into the world of Conan the Barbarian and see what happens? And that's the basic premise of these Richard Blade books. Now, Richard Blade is an operative for Great Britain's MI6 spy agency. And at the beginning of each book, a scientist working for the government uses a supercomputer to teleport Richard Blade to Dimension X, which is slightly different every time, but nearly always involves a world of like tribes and swords and armies and kind of weird creatures. Richard Blade always joins up with one side or another in some kind of epic civil war or battle that's going on for justice. And while he's in Dimension X, and then he does the fighting, wins the battle, learns a lesson, maybe gets some technology, and then he's transported back to London. When he returns back to London, he usually has a souvenir or a bit of knowledge that's going to be of benefit to Great Britain, which is why Great Britain spends the money sending him back to Dimension X every book. I have to say the books are rather formulaic. The first chapter is always in London with his boss and this scientist who has the technology. The last chapter is nearly always Blade's return to England. And the core of the novel has Blade fighting and partaking in these Conan-like adventures, and he gets laid a lot, Eric. More than you, more than me. Richard Blade gets laid a lot.
It does sound like Conan.
Yeah, so he always arrives in Dimension X naked, so his first order of business is usually procuring some kind of loincloth. I should have mentioned that these books are fairly sexually graphic, and the females on Dimension X are universally horny.
Of course.
Yes. All the books in the series are published under the house name of Geoffrey Lord, but I want to tell you who the real authors are. Books 1 through 8 were written by Manning Lee Stokes. Now, the conventional wisdom, and I tend to agree with that, is that these are the best books of the bunch. I've read most of them, and they were good. Books 9 through 37, with one exception, I'll get to that, were written by a guy named Roland J. Green. Now, he was a fantasy author who wrote 7 books in the Conan series between 1988 and 1997. I read one of his Richard Blade books. It was number 26, called City of the Living Dead, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I'll say that people who are really, really into this series always prefer those first 8 installments by Manning Lee Stokes.
Was City of the Living Dead a zombie book?
No, it actually kind of resembled the the movie Wall-E. I mean, no, neither one of them was ripping the other off. The idea is that there's these primitives on the outside walls of the city, and inside the city are these like super fat people like living very poshly with
I
like
see.
robots doing all their work for them. And so it evolves in kind of a battle between the haves and the have-nots. The reason I picked that one up off the shelf was because I thought it would be kind of a cool zombie thing because of the Living Dead thing. But it was a good book, but it didn't fulfill my zombie wishes.
Okay.
The only book in the Richard Blade series not written by Mr. Stokes or Mr. Green was number 30. It was called Dimension of Horror by Ray Faraday Nelson, whose claim to fame was a short story called 8 o'clock in the morning. Eric, you'll appreciate this, which was the basis for the John Carpenter movie They Live, starring master thespian Roddy Piper.
Hot Rod,
yes.
Roddy Piper.
My favorite wrestler when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've not read this Richard Blade book, but it might be good. I don't know. Did you even know that They Live was based on a short story?
I did not.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, that's interesting.
You do now. So the series ran for 37 installments, and then it stopped in 1984. Lyle Kenyon Ingle is dead, and his son owns the rights to the Richard Blade books and all the other books that Book Creations Incorporated put out. The son has really dropped the ball as far as making his intellectual property available to modern readers, so you're going to need to search for old paperbacks if you want to read any books in this series. Man, I go back and forth on this. Regarding the quality of the Richard Blade series, I can say honestly that I enjoyed the first 3 or so that I read. Then you start to realize that every one of them is exactly the same. Richard Blade beams into Dimension X, falls in with an oppressed clan of some kind, helps them defeat their oppressors, he gets laid, and beams home. Again and again and again. It's a fun formula, but I don't think I could read more than one every year or two at this point. Listener, if you want to read this series, and you probably should, start with the first 8. The series order doesn't matter one bit. There's no like origin story at the very beginning. They're dopey Sword and Planet books, but you're not going to get lost. You can read any single one of them.
I've never heard of that term, Sword and Planet. Is that like
think of John Carter of Mars.
Okay.
Did you ever read that?
No.
Yeah, same type of thing, where someone is transported to another planet that functionally ends up being in many ways more primitive than ours, and so they're fighting with swords.
So it's basically a combination of fantasy and science fiction.
Yeah, I would say exactly.
Okay, Sword and Planet. Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, everyone says that the books are James Bond meets Conan. I think that's right. I think there is a huge debt, like I mentioned, to the John Carter of Mars books by Edgar Rice Burroughs, and the Gore novels by John Norman. Have you ever read a Gore novel?
I haven't.
G-O-R, Gore. Have you ever seen them or heard of them?
No, I don't think I've ever even seen one.
Oh my God! Okay, so I got to take a side thing. So the Gore series launched in 1966, and it ran for 34 installments. Wildly popular fantasy kind of Sword and Planet series. They're supposed to be super misogynistic, and they're filled with lots of like S&M imagery. I tried reading the first one, but I could not get into it. But the thing to know is that there's this whole subculture of dudes who have adopted the Gorean lifestyle. And if you want to have a trip down a weird wormhole, type in Gorean, Gorean lifestyle into Google and see where it takes you. What these guys who are into it, they ritually humiliate their wives or girlfriends by having them live as slaves, wearing like collars and leashes and stuff. How do you think that would go over in your household, Eric?
You know, it's funny. My wife is really into that stuff, so I'm sure she would probably embrace it. I've never introduced it into our lives, but hey, the night is still young.
Yeah, well, again, you may be into the Gore books. This could be exactly what you've been looking for. For me, my wife's a great cook, and I feel that I'll catch more flies with honey rather than vinegar, so I'm going to keep just complimenting her. I think that if I asked her to wear a leash, it might have a chilling effect on the pumpkin chocolate chip muffin she's been making lately. And so she continues to be responsible for my obesity. Anyway, so if that's your scene, listener, you may like the Gore books by John Gorman, and Gore is G-O-R. As far as the Richard Blade books go, definitely worth trying one or two, see how you like them. The series was very popular and was translated into Swedish, French, German, Greek, and Russian. A couple little epilogues about the series. In the early 1990s, the Russians, they could only get the rights to reprint books 1 through 6 of the series. Now, the Russian publisher hired a translator named Mikhail Akhmanov to translate the books from English to Russian. The series, at least those 6 books, were such a huge hit in Russia, but for some reason the Russians couldn't reach a deal with Lyle Kenyon Ingle for the rest of the books. It's not clear to me why the Russians just didn't steal the books and start printing them, but they didn't. Instead, that Russian publisher hired the translator, Mikhail Akhmenov, to write 16 sequels himself, starring Richard Blade. And I gather this kind of launched the translator's career as an author. He wrote Russian-language sequels to the Conan books and about 50 fantasy and science fiction books of his own. So if you're really starved for more hot Richard Blade action, all you need to do is learn Russian, and then you're good to go with 16 new novels that have never seen an English translation or publication. Or if you speak French, I read this blog every now and then called Legends of Men, and they said that the French Richard Blade series continued for over 200 volumes into 2008. I don't know if those were done with or without permission from Engel, but so that's also an option if you're into it. So anyway, that's all I have on the Richard Blade series by Jeffrey Lord. Unless you got something else about this, why don't you go ahead and do your review, Eric?
All right, sounds good. And you've convinced me to read one of those books.
Yeah, I think you'll dig it.
Yeah. All right, so today I'm reviewing a cornerstone in the Mac Bolan Executioner universe. This is Phoenix Force number 1, Argentine Deadline. If you'll recall, we briefly touched on this series, I guess it was last year, with our 5th episode of the show. And that feature was the Executioner series and, all of the offshoots and history of the character. It's definitely worth revisiting because we covered a lot of ground there. The Executioner series stars a vigilante named Mac Bolan who wages war with the Mafia. Author Don Pendleton created the series, and he authored 37 of the series' first 38 installments before selling the rights to Gold Eagle. Now, that publisher continued the series from 1981 through 2017. Totaling a whopping 450-plus novels. The series' longevity can be credited to events that happened in 1981 with the series' 39th installment, The New War, written by Saul Warwick. Now, these marketing geniuses came up with a way to extend the shelf life of the character by switching him from a fugitive vigilante to a government employee. With The New War book, Mac Bolan becomes a government operative named John Phoenix, and eventually will work out of a headquarters in Northern Virginia called Stony Man Farm. Now, how does any of this relate to Phoenix Force number 1, you might ask? A year after The New War was published, Gold Eagle decided to launch 2 more series in the Executioner universe. These were Able Team and Phoenix Force. The idea was that many of Bolan's former military personnel, as well as the law enforcement allies he made in his Mafia war, could just sort of all collaborate together and work out of the Stony Man Farm. Now, Able Team launched in June of 1982, and it would run for 56 books, which is essentially a 10-year run, which ended in 1992. And I'm not going to bore you with my thoughts on the first Able Team novel. You can listen to that on episode 32 from earlier this year, or you can just read the review on the blog, either one. Now, Phoenix Force launched at the same time as Able Team, sort of this double-barreled marketing scheme. Phoenix Force would run 58 books and also end in 1992. But today I'm looking at the debut book, Argentine Deadline, written by a science fiction author named Robert Hoskins. Now, despite who wrote the book, the covers feature a house name of Gar Wilson and Don Pendleton. This is similar to what Able Team did with their books written under house name Dick Stivers and Don Pendleton. It's just a revolving door of authors.
Eventually they got rid of Don Pendleton's name on them, right?
I think after like the first 3 or 4, they removed him.
Makes sense. If they're trying to leverage his fame from Bolan,
right,
and make the connection.
Yeah, exactly. And eventually in 1992, after those series ran their course, they all sort of culminated together as the Stony Man books. And there's a bunch of those too. But in this Phoenix Force debut, it features 5 super soldiers arriving at the Stony Man Farm to meet Mac Bolan and each other in sort of this round table, get-to-know-you sort of meeting. And it's here where each member gives their background to the room and the reader. And here's how the team shakes out. There's David McCarter. He's a British commando expert with a background as an SAS officer. Gary Manning. He's Canadian. He's an explosives expert. You've got Rafael Enciso, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, Cuban-American expert with a penchant for underwater warfare. And then there's this guy, Yakov Katz, or Yak. He kind of goes by both. The last name is Katzonalamolga.
Easy for you to say.
French-Israeli. He's a battle-scarred warrior. In fact, he's missing part of his, I think his right arm or left arm. He's missing part of that. There's Kilo O'Hara. He's a Japanese martial arts expert. You know, because it's the 1980s and there has to be a karate guy. The first mission is also provided to the team during this introduction phase. 7 Americans have been abducted in Argentina by a terrorist group called ERP. This is thankfully short for Ejército Revolucionario de Pueblo, whatever that is. These American men and 1 woman were invited to the romantic Argentina by the country's overtaxed government. But instead of this warm welcome and an open exchange of ideas, the scholars are abducted by this terrorist group and taken into captivity as bargaining chips in a robust ransom scheme. Now, just like Able Team, these books often featured a group of innocents becoming captive of some extreme militant group. With that concept, the books feature perspectives from the captives as well as the heroes. And that's the case here, with many of the chapters dedicated to the group's survival at the hands of the terrorists. And, I sort of like that aspect, and it sort of, for me, it brought a lot of humanity to what otherwise is just an action-soaked shoot-'em-up. The book's main stars, at least in this installment, is McCarter and Manning, and they're kind of the fighting duo who does a lot of the heavy lifting throughout the narrative. Nearly all of the characters themselves star in solo missions throughout the book that incur heavy firefights in the quest for information. These solo missions are really effective in displaying each character's strengths combined with their background. I really liked this book, and I felt it was just way, way better than the Able Team debut. That book sucked, and this one is just so much fun. And I like the characters, I like the action, and I'm really excited that I have so many more Phoenix Force novels to devour in the coming years. But again, this book is Phoenix Force number 1, Argentine Deadline by Robert Hoskins.
Is it fair to say that Phoenix Force were foreign adventures and Able Team was domestic, or is it not that simple, you think?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the case.
Okay.
You
ever utilize macbolin.com as a resource?
Sometimes.
It's really good.
Yeah, it is.
And because it's a fan site, and but the Mac Bolin universe, the people who are into that, what they've done is they've gone in there and they basically rated every single book. And so, the people are the fans of the series are saying which books are best, and then it ranks which books are best. And so you can go to any book in the series and see that, Army of Devils from Able Team is great, but this particular one's terrible. And so it ends up being a really great resource to people who want to explore books in that Mac Bolin universe and just sort of avoid the bad ones, because it's a good series, but very uneven. And there's terrible books and there's really great books.
Yeah, and what I've noticed also in researching that series is you may have to read it in numerical order, because I've learned that
Able Team and Phoenix Force?
Yes.
Really?
Well, at least Phoenix Force, because some of the team members actually get killed as it goes, and they get replaced by new members who get killed. So it's
like Menudo.
Yeah, it's kind of. But yeah, Able Team is domestic. Phoenix Force is international. And the name Phoenix Force isn't very original. That's actually from X-Men in the 1970s.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, let's shift gears. My review today is a book called One for the Road by Howard Hunt. Writing is Robert Dietrich. Conventional wisdom says that the best books by the CIA operative and Watergate burglar Howard Hunt were the ones that he wrote under that pseudonym of Robert Dietrich. Now, One for the Road is a 1954 standalone crime noir novel that's been re-released by Cutting Edge Press in both trade paperback and ebook formats. The book begins in Florida in a Gulf Coast town called DeSoto. Our narrator is a con artist and Korean War veteran named Larry Roberts. He grew up a poor orphan and has decided to remedy that by latching on to a rich sugar mama and then disappearing with her money. Conveniently, he meets a 40-year-old wealthy woman named Sophie who's got this hot smoking body and a decent face. And even better, her husband has been dead for a year. So Larry, our hero, is a bit of a heel, and he's definitely a misogynist, but he's also very charming, and he's clever and funny and unrepentant about what he does and who he is. You, the reader, are going to hate yourself for liking him as much as you do, especially when he's conning money out of these otherwise nice and lovely ladies. As the paperback progresses, there's a cool gambling subplot that becomes a major source of tension and anxiety for both Larry and the reader, before settling into a rather typical femme fatale story. The coolest things about this thin paperback were the innovative story arcs and vivid settings. Larry covers a lot of ground in this novel, which basically weaves 3 separate plots into this overarching narrative. I read a lot of books with similar plots like this, and I just had really no idea where this one was going. It was really just very masterful plotting. Of all the Howard Hunt books I've read, One for the Road is the best of the bunch by a mile. There's sex, there's violence, duplicity, and intrigue. I am thrilled to see that this paperback has made a comeback for modern audiences. Listener, this is a vintage novel that you deserve, and I cannot recommend it highly enough.
Have you read a bad Howard Hunt book?
I've read one, that Cuban one I read. I think I might have given it a good review.
Okay.
It was just kind of okay. It was clearly Howard Hunt, who was involved in the Bay of Pigs thing when he was with the CIA, was clearly kind of processing that when he wrote that. I can't even remember the name of it. I reviewed it earlier this year. It was just kind of okay. I mean, Howard Hunt is no one's favorite author,
right?
But this book was just exceptional.
I hear the Bimini Run is the one I want to read.
Bimini Run.
Bimini Run. Yeah,
I've heard that's great. Stephen Mertz actually told me it was fantastic.
Okay,
so.
that's the one I want.
Anyway, so with that, Eric, I think we can probably put a pin in this episode. Why don't you wrap us up?
This concludes the 70th episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. You can read our book reviews every day at paperbackwarrior.com and follow us on Facebook and Twitter to join the conversation. We'll be back next Monday with another podcast episode. So on behalf of Tom, this is Eric signing off.